and when I looked at the list, I didn't see that anybody, Bonnie Hilkatis, Danielle Rector, and Mark Webb. Yes, and I don't know why you weren't on the list because, you know, Kim had pulled this up. Kim Brown is the one that does this for us, like this week, earlier this week. And Neil's been having some trouble too with two things. Apparently, you know, getting the members and entered correctly, but I think even last month we knew that they were having trouble with notifying people if their memberships were due to be renewed. And when you signed in, if you were an existing member and your name is in bold, it means you are not renewed as far as they're concerned. So check to make sure that you are renewed and let them know, or maybe you're being dropped, but you're still open.
That can't be right. You've got us in bold, and I know we've renewed.
Right. I saw that you were on there. It's like in bold, like, huh? So I'm not sure who you contacted about that. So, okay. Finance.
No change from last month. We are trialing a new camera today.
Yes.
That should make things even better, and better for Greg when he has to do all the manipulations in order to get it ready for YouTube. So once we figure out that this is good today, there will be a reimbursement for that camera.
Yeah.
We didn't want to do it before we knew it would.
I'll jump down out of order here on my agenda. That the YouTube site is now up for the chapter and active, and I think 3 of the meetings have all
November, January, and February
are already posted there. So if you in the future aren't able to make it to the meeting, it's always better to be here in person because then you can ask questions and all. But if you miss, or for any of you that live 2.5 hours away from here, you still get to learn what the presenters are teaching us. So that is up, and on the email I put out the website. I didn't think to write it here. I know there was some question in there because it was like an @ sign in the address, but apparently that was okay. So that worked okay. Other projects. Okay, the Beasley Knob Native Plant Garden, which we had been calling the Satterfield site, but it's actually at Beasley Knob OHV parking lot, and they now have a day use facility there. So hopefully once it opens for the season, right now the road in there is not open. Does anybody use that for on-highway vehicle use? Okay.
If there's been too much rain, they don't open it.
Right, and I think otherwise it's April, is the beginning of April is when they're, otherwise it's closed during the winter months because they don't want to ruin their trails. But we have applied for the certification for the Connect to Protect for the pollinator garden. And I don't know how long that takes. Has anyone done this formally before? The Connect to Protect? Okay, so I don't know how long that should take. You know, we submit our design and the plants that we have to make sure we have 3 spring bloomers, 3 summer bloomers, 3 fall bloomers. I think it had to have 2 plants that feed larvae for the local pollinators, and all of that. You know, I submitted it, but I don't know if they want to come out and look at it because we just planted it last fall and everything's dormant. It just looks like a dead log there. So right now, so I don't know if they wait to do the certification until that opens up. But there will be other work to do there because we have to finish out the trail better. We're going to be the Forestry Service. It's on forestry land, and they are paying to put in a fence to sort of outline it so that when people don't come traipsing through it, they go on the little path inside. And I don't know the timeline for that. Okay, another thing that came up, and you would have seen this in the emails if you're getting that, the Lenfoot Hike In is over towards Amicalola Falls. So it's a little distance. Okay, I'm pointing this way. That is correct. Is that west of here? And so, sorry?
It's an easy one.
Is it, well, they said it was, well, when I went online, oh, have you? Awesome.
But not recently.
Well, what's happening is they are redoing their garden beds, and they were already native plants, but they want to make sure that what they put in again is native. We have a bunch of name tags to donate to them, so they can do IDs on all of those. And we're very grateful for the fact that they thought to contact us, and it turned out that one of our members, Jeff Barrett, had helped with the initial installation, so he's very connected, but I don't think they knew that when they went through us. Okay, I got a notice just this past week from the GNPS that habitat certification cards are being sent to us. I don't know what that entails, so this is something I guess that GNPS has been doing in the past through the chapters to certify that you have presumably native plant gardens. I will have to find out what the process is for that, but pretty soon we should have the little card. It said a card rack. A rack of cards? Okay, we'll find out what that is. And they also have raffle tickets. We don't have raffles, but maybe we need to have a raffle. Get money or something. Okay, also here on the agenda is we are looking for a vice president because our vice president was very helpful and all, but has now then had to go back to work. So felt like she can't really carry that. And sort of sadly, we don't have our secretary or our member at large here today either. So we're the board.
I'm here.
But this coming at the annual meeting in December will be when board members are either replaced or renewed in two-year terms. You can have two back-to-back terms. But even if you don't want to have an official board role or anything like that, it would be really nice if we could have more assistance with things like reaching out to local governments to encourage them to plant native plants in the public land. Education. I had a new member actually asked me to come talk to his high school, I think it's a high school class. So far, he hasn't told me when. So, but education is a big part of why we even exist, letting people know the importance of native plants. Okay, YouTube site is already, so if you think you might want to help with that, please let us know. YouTube site has been activated, and upcoming events, the plant sale. So please be working on that to make sure that we have enough plants. We had, was that in January that Jonathan did the, yeah, that was very good. We ended up buying 2 of those arrow gardens, and they did wonderfully, but it's going to take more than 2 little arrow gardens. Okay, yes.
Will there be a central drop-off? You can't bid a plant sale with something?
Yeah, you can contact people. I think last time we brought somebody dropped stuff off for us, or you can get there when they're first setting up. If you can at least get there, that might be easier. Make sure you have a little ID tag in each one of them and some information about what the plant is. Okay. Judy McCann is in charge of it. She's organizing it. Thank you for that. Yes. We had no idea. Okay, Jess Riddle is our speaker over here. Watch out, there are tripping hazards here, which is very unfortunate for someone walking on, doing a presentation here. A BS in multidisciplinary plant ecology from Furman University and Masters in ecology from the State University of New York, College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Okay. Georgia native though, so you went, okay. Who works for the Wilderness Society to unite people to protect lands, public lands in the Southern Appalachians, which is an important thing for the Native Plant Society as well. So that's wonderful. He has led ForestWatch's project to locate old-growth forests in North Georgia and nominated over 40 state champion trees which I had to look that up to find out what state champion trees are. And they are trees of a certain size or age or just
They're the biggest ones.
the really big ones. Those are champion trees. And so, do they get like a little plaque or something? Or how?
Sometimes,
Okay. So people know that these are champion trees. You want to be out there for that. Okay. Done research also on climate tree growth relationships and disturbance and succession in floodplains, which obviously is an important thing since we have a lot of disturbances going on in most of the land here. So anyway, Jess Riddle is our speaker.
Thank you, Teryn. Thanks for having me here. It's great to meet your group and talk to y'all today. So other groups I've talked to, the emphasis has been on tree ID, and like a lot of tree-focused talks, I think focus on ID. And usually those talks focus on maybe a few kind of really easily recognizable characteristics, like the white bark of sycamore, or the distinguishing characteristics between different species, like Southern red oak has U-shaped bases to the leaves, whereas there are other red oaks around here have more wedge-shaped leaf bases. And then maybe the presentation will include something on mnemonics to help remember some of those characteristics. Like one of my favorite ones is mad buck for the trees in our region that have opposite leaves. So that's maple, ash, and dogwood. That's the mad, and then buck is buckeye. So that can be kind of helpful because there's not that many trees in our region that have opposite leaves. But I think often when traits for plants are being taught, they're taught kind of as being somewhat arbitrary, like that's just the way the plant happens to be. But in fact, the way plants look and all of the features that make them stand out to us are plants' solutions to problems that they face. So I want to kind of take that approach to talking about some trees and groups of trees within our region and why they look like the way they do. I'm going to start off with one of the better known but more striking examples, which is longleaf pine. So these are longleaf pines growing on Pine Mountain in the middle of Georgia, and longleaf pine gets up into the mountains in North Georgia. It goes up north of Rome in the Ridge and Valley. And this is a longleaf pine seedling, which doesn't look like a normal tree seedling. All the other little green dots around there are shortleaf pine seedlings, looking more like normal pine seedlings. Obviously this is very different, but there's a reason that most plants don't take this approach. When the longleaf pine is sitting here in what's called the grass stage, and will be in that stage anywhere from 2 to 15 years, it's not adding a lot of new photosynthetic area. It's not growing like it could. It's not really making progress towards being a tree and reproducing, which obviously is of critical importance for it. And then it goes from this stage to something that looks like it's out of Dr. Seuss. So this is called bolting, where it shoots up from that grass stage to a young sapling. And then after this point, it'll start growing much more normally and looking like a normal tree. So what's it doing here? Like, why has it given up the opportunity for above ground growth for several years? If we think about what's happening, it's gone from not growing in height to growing in height really rapidly. So what it's done is minimize the time near the ground, or the time that the bud is near the ground. And that's important because where longleaf pines grow, fire is a very frequent disturbance. Across most of longleaf pine's range, you'll have fire every about 1 to 3 years. Not every site, but on a lot of sites. And when fire comes through, the heat isn't actually highest at the ground surface. As heat rises, the highest heat is going to be a little above the ground. So longleaf pine has evolved to expose that vulnerable bud to high heat for as little time as possible. So here's a longleaf pine seedling where a fire has come through earlier in the year. This photo was in early May. It doesn't look just the needles for that growing season coming out, and all the older needles got burned off. But this was a fairly low intensity fire, as most fires that longleaf pine are exposed to are. So it's got enough thick bark even on that young shoot, and it got its bud high enough up that the fire kind of passed over it, often literally passing over it when you're in the grass stage, and it could survive it just fine. And then, I want to actually explain some of the distinctive features. So longleaf pine, of course, the most obvious feature are those long needles. And they kind of play back into this fire story. So because longleaf pine is so well adapted to frequent fires, that gives it a competitive advantage when there is fire, because many of the other woody plants won't be as well adapted to fire. So it's in longleaf pine's interest to actually promote fire, and those long needles help do that. Longleaf pine needles are some of the fastest drying foliage of any plant within our region. And also, because those needles are long, they won't pack closely together. So this leaf litter here underneath them is going to have a lot of oxygen flow through it. So dry fuel with good oxygen supply makes it easier to burn. It means that longleaf pine leaf litter can burn on a lot of days when other leaf litter wouldn't be able to. And then also in that grass stage, when it can't produce that many leaves, it's helpful to have extra long leaves to kind of maximize exposed synthetic area. And of course, there's constraints on just how long it can get. So our mountain populations, and this is from mountains in Alabama here, our mountain populations actually have slightly shorter needles than those in the coastal plain, because they're more likely to be exposed to ice at that time. That's going to make having those longer needles a big impediment. So the ones in the coastal plain where ice isn't as much of an issue are going to have longer needles. And then longleaf pine isn't our only pine in the region with very distinctive features. This is pitch pine. Its needles are about the same length as loblolly pines. The cones are about the same size as loblolly pine cones, although they tend to be much rounder. But one thing that can make pitch pine easy to distinguish from any other pine in this region is it's the only one that often has these sprouts coming out of the trunk. These are called epicormic sprouts, epi meaning on, and corm meaning stem or bowl. So these are sprouts that are literally on the stem. And again, this is something you're not going to see in a lot of other species. Hardwood trees, when they're stressed, will send out epicormic sprouts as kind of a last-ditch effort. But most of the time, it doesn't really make sense to have a bunch of epicormic sprouts, because leaves are for capturing light energy, and the trunk is an area that is reliably going to not have as much light. So, why is pitch pine taking this approach? Well, it comes back to where pitch pines grow. It is very much a mountain species around here. They grow on ridge tops, they grow on south and west facing slopes. So these are all relatively dry habitats. So again, these are places that are going to be exposed to fire. It's a little different than the fire that longleaf pine was exposed to, though. It's not going to come through as frequently. It may get much hotter. So here's a stand over in Raven County. You can tell it top-killed all the surrounding vegetation. It was hot enough up in the crowns to actually kill the needles and probably those twig tips on the pitch pines. But this situation also presents an opportunity for pitch pine if it can survive, because again, all that competing vegetation has been cleared out. So the pitch pine, because of those epicormic sprouts, it can actually regrow a crown very quickly from the trunk. So this is probably 2 or 3 years after a fairly intense fire went through, and you can see it's got a lot of leaf area again quite quickly, and this is something that other conifers in the region couldn't do. And then if we're talking about distinctive characteristics for our pines in the mountains, one of the most distinctive ones is the cones of Table Mountain pine. So here, the two really distinctive things about these cones is that they stay closed. So that's why these cones are covered with lichens, because they been up in the tree for many years. And then if you're gonna have cones that are supposed to sit in the tree for many years, it's helpful to defend them. So we've got these big stout prickles. So, you know, they're about the same size as a loblolly pine cone, you know, yay big. But they're very heavily armored. Like, you kind of gotta be careful when you're picking them up so that you're not poking yourself too much. And they're often whorled around the branches in groups of 3. So you can see there's a third cone in the shade down there. So this can make Table Mountain pine really easily identifiable from a distance because it looks like it's got these big clubs up in the top of the ground. You can see those from 200 or 300 yards away. So why are these cones sitting on the trees for years? So these cones were produced at the tip of the tree because, you know, trees don't move up like a conveyor belt. And then they've been there long enough that it's gotten, you know, it's gone from the tip of the tree to 10-inch diameter stem.
So how long would that be?
So this one was probably growing fairly quickly, but, you know, at least a decade, maybe 2 decades that those cones have been sitting there.
Wow.
So, like, you know, the cone's reproduction, it's got the seeds in it. The seeds aren't going to sprout if they're in the tree, so what is this doing? You know, it seems like, you know, the tree would be much better served from getting those seeds on the ground. But the tree actually needs more than that. It needs the seeds to land on the ground in a spot where the conditions are appropriate for growth, which in the case of most of our pines around here means a thin duff or humus layer. Our pines need to get contact with mineral soil when they're still very small. And most of our pines are also shade intolerant, so it needs a lot of light. Well, with wind dispersed seeds, the tree can't direct its seeds specifically to those locations, but what it can do is time it so that seeds are released when those conditions are present. And that's what Table Mountain pine is doing. So these cones are actually made so that heat will melt wax that holds the scales closed. So where you find Table Mountain pine is steep slopes. And steep slopes are important because when a fire hits steep slopes, it's going to preheat and dry the fuel upslope from it. So when the fuel moves up and hits those areas, it can release energy really quickly and have a very intense fire. Often there's also mountain laurel underneath Table Mountain pines, which again is going to let the fire move off the ground and help it kind of move up into the canopy somewhat. So Table Mountain pines are a species of locations where intense fire is likely. That intense fire heats the crown of the tree, melting the wax that's holding the cones together. And then those seedlings come down on this landscape where the intense fire has burned off most of the humus and duff layer. It's also killed, or at least killed back to the ground, most of the surrounding vegetation. So those seedlings are released and sprouting when the conditions are right for them to take off and grow. And that's why we have these really distinctive cones on the trees. It's not the only pine in North Georgia that has persistent cones. This is Virginia pine. But these cones don't stay closed. They just tend to kind of hang out in the tree. I'm including this one as kind of an example of where the pitfalls with always looking for something in the present environment to explain the traits you see. So to explain these persistent cones, we actually have to look at the history of Virginia pine, and it's helpful to look at what it's related to. So Virginia pine has 3 close relatives in North America: lodgepole pine, which grows all over the mountains out west; jack pine, which grows in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, and Canada; and sand pine, which grows in kind of the center of the Florida Peninsula. All 3 of these are similar to Virginia pine in that they've got very short needles. Virginia pine actually has shorter needles than shortleaf pine does, and relatively small cones. And then all 3 of these species also have some populations with cones that stay closed and wait for fire, and then some populations that open up in response to fire. So that trait of cones is called serotiny. So Table Mountain pine and these kind of short or Virginia pine relatives from other parts of the country have serotinous cones. And Virginia pine, because it's not exposed to an appropriate fire regime as much, lost the trait of holding the cones closed, but has kept the kind of less consequential trait of holding the cones in the tree. All right, so I'm not going to just talk about pines and fire the whole time. We have lots of species around here with much more colorful fruits. If we look at these fruits, there's some real similarities. There's kind of a fairly limited color palette here. We've got dark blues and then bright reds on these fruits. They're all about the same size as well. As many of you have probably already guessed, these are bird dispersed fruits, but there's a little bit more to it than just that. A couple other traits that these fruits share is they're very rich in lipids. They're essentially high-fat fruits, and they all mature in very late summer. And that timing is not coincidental. So late summer is when our migratory birds come through, and these are all fruits that have been kind of shaped by those migratory birds. The high fat is kind of what the birds are looking for to fuel their long distance migration flight. And then the coloring is to attract the bird's attention. Black gum's another good example. It doesn't have red stems on the dark blue fruits, but it will do what's called flagging, where you've got a few red leaves that turn early as a way to notify the birds that the fruits are there. And we can contrast this a little bit with fruits that are eaten by birds and other animals in general, in particular non-migratory birds. So we've got American holly, bright red fruit, doesn't have nearly the fat content or lipid content as those other ones do. And also like black cherry, that has more sugar, less fat in it. It's eaten by a wide range of things. And the strategy here is kind of, these fruits won't be as preferred by the birds, but they'll eat them in the winter when they kind of don't have anything else around. So these are fruits that are for our non-migratory birds, so more like titmice and others that are going to stay through the winter. And then if we're talking about animals shaping plants, kind of the classic example is flowers. Orchids are often held up here because orchids can come up with all kinds of different shapes to manipulate their insect pollinators. And mountain laurel is an example, kind of a fun example from our region. So this mountain laurel has a little bit more red on it than most of the mountain laurels do around here. But if you look at each one of those red splotches, you'll see this kind of white line or this kind of white filament going to it. And if you look kind of in the center, you can see on the back of the flowers there's these little protuberances. So what's going on is the stamens are actually, each one is tucked into its own individual pocket. And the stamen is flexed. So what happens is when a bee comes by, and they are bee pollinated, the vibrations from the bee's wings let loose the stamens, and then the stamen springs up and whacks the bee with pollen. Doesn't hurt the bee, because the plant wants the bee to be able to get to the next flower too, but kind of a fun pollination strategy that has literally shaped the flower. If our shrubs can produce that impressive flower display, surely our big trees can do better. But for like a different group, I might have asked, do oaks even have flowers? This is a willow oak on the left and a blackjack oak on the right. But a lot of our big trees don't have impressive flowers. So our oaks, our hickories, our maples, our walnuts, beech, birch, none of them have very impressive flower. And yet, flowers have been kind of a key for flowering plants to radiate out into over 100,000 species on Earth. Having an insect take your pollen from exactly where it's produced to where it needs to go is a pretty good deal. And surely our big trees have the resources to produce showy flowers, so why don't they? So there's kind of a cost and an opportunity to having wind-pollinated flowers. The savings to it is producing petals is the cost of the plant, and nectar is just like giving away money for the plant. So wind pollinated flowers saves on those costs, and our big trees simply have a better opportunity to do it than our other plants do. You know, their height puts them up into a lot more wind. You know, there's a lot less wind on a forest floor if it's, you know, buffered by trees around it. These flowers are produced in the spring, which is generally a windier time of year. They're produced as the leaves are coming out, but the leaves haven't blocked the airflow around them. So it's kind of this convergence of factors that just lets our big trees have wind-dispersed flowers. If we think about wind-pollinated smaller plants like grasses, grasses are really plants of open habitats for the most part. So it all kind of fits together. So another kind of conspicuous trait of oaks around here is that they leaf out much later than other species. And you know, it's pretty easy to understand why plants leaf out later in the north and the south, or at high elevations rather than low elevations. You know, climate's a big factor, and most plants are cued by kind of accumulated warmth or when to leaf out. It's harder to understand why in the same climate, you know, we have plants leafing out on one side of the ridge, but still dormant on the other side of the ridge. And like a buckeye will leaf out weeks before an oak, even if like the yellow buckeye and the northern red oak are growing in the same code. So like, what explains that? And it comes down to wood anatomy, actually. So one easy way to identify oaks, they have these very large rays. They're in other plants, but they're much more prominent in oak wood. The other thing you'll notice about that oak wood, this is a cross section here, is that they've got these great big vessel elements. Like these are vessels. And a lot of other trees that leaf out earlier, they have vessels, but they're much smaller. So, you know, black cherry, yellow buckeye, they leaf out quite early. They've got vessels, but they're way smaller. And the other thing is with the oaks are what are called ring porous, because these big pores make up the ring, versus these other species are called diffuse pores, because the vessels are diffused throughout the ring. So the boundary for a ring is going to go right here, and all of these are growing from bottom to top. So this is the end of 1 year's growth and the beginning of the next year's growth. And in all these big vessels, they're the first things that are being produced. And that's kind of a key thing that's going on here. So these big vessels, the advantage is they can move water very efficiently. You know, there's much less friction involved here. The disadvantage is they're very vulnerable to breaking, what's called cavitation. You get an air bubble in there, and it's a blockage in the pipe. And freezing conditions are one thing that will cause cavitation. So over the course of the winter, the oaks, and to some extent our hickories too, these big vessels are prone to getting blocked, essentially. So by the time spring comes around, the oak has no real conductive tissue. It has to grow new conductive tissue before the leaves can be put out. Contrast that with these diffuse porous species. They have functional conduction going back 4 or 5 rings usually. So they can start putting out leaves right away. You know, versus the oaks, before they can supply water. So it's all kind of coming down to when freezing occurs. The diffuse porous species, they're waiting for the end of freezing to be able to produce leaves. The oaks and these other ring porous or semi-ring porous species, they're waiting for the end of freezing to do the growth to then be able to put out leaves. So that's what's kind of driving this difference in who leaves out first in spring. But our champion for this region in resisting cavitation and maintaining functional water transport are eastern red cedars. So they are as resistant to cavitation as the pinyon pines in the American Southwest, and the junipers that grow in the pinyon juniper woodlands are even more resistant. So that means that that is one thing that helps them grow on dry rock outcrops. You know, this tree's just got this like little pocket of soil right here. You'll see them growing out cracks and crevices as well. So that little pocket of soil, it doesn't take long to dry out. Like oaks, they can go down deep, access moisture from kind of longer ago. These guys, like if it dries out for very long at all, like they're kind of out of moisture. But junipers are the best at not suffering permanent damage from that moisture drying out. And then the small leaves also help them in this situation. Small leaves tend to lose less water than large leaves do. So those are the factors of why you can see Eastern red cedar growing up on rock outcrops. You know, you go over to Young Harris and you can see it on some of the rock exposures over there. You know, and then if we're talking about what's damage and protection to the tissue within a tree trunk, like that's the purpose of bark. And you may have noticed the bark on some species around here with white dots or lines on it. You know, all these horizontal lines on a black birch. It's a really conspicuous feature of the bark. It shows up really prominently on spice bush as well. So bark, while it's protective and keeps the outside out and inside in, also presents a little bit of a challenge because there's living tissue right underneath that bark. The cambium's there, and all living cells need oxygen. In the leaves, you know, they're taking in from the air, getting it from the CO2, but in general, like that's more difficult underneath the bark. So these dots and lines in the bark are what are called lenticels, and their purpose is gas exchange. They are there to let oxygen into the cambium and take carbon dioxide out from the cambium. And then, you know, I'm going to switch back to leaves a little bit because leaves are such a key characteristic in identifying plants. I can't go through a presentation like this without mentioning buffalo nut, which is not one of our most conspicuous species, but it is one of our weirdest. So easiest way to identify it is by the fruits. You know, and it's a shrub, usually kind of about head high. And in this picture, it's early spring, and like all this green is essentially all buffalo nut in the This was a forest that had a particularly large amount of it. The flowers aren't very conspicuous. It's got these little green flowers, little five-parted flowers. But one of the unusual characteristics about buffalo nut is that it's a parasite. And it will parasitize all kinds of different things. It doesn't parasitize everything, but it's been shown to parasitize over 60 different species of flowering plants, over 30 different families. So it is tapped into the trees in this photo. It can do its own photosynthesis, so it's not really reliant on the trees for sugars. What's getting from the trees are water and nutrients. So it has the problem of how to make the water flow not into the tree, but into itself when it's tapped into the tree. And that's where this leafing out early in the spring comes in. They also, in the fall, have the odd habit of not really changing colors and keeping green leaves on when everything else has already started changing colors. Leafing out early in the spring and keeping green leaves in the fall means that it has the pores in the leaves, the stomatas are open, it's transpiring, it's pulling water through itself, so it's creating a kind of source-sink relationship. It's essentially like vacuuming the water out of the host plant and into itself because it has functional leaves when the host plant's dead. And then kind of, you know, leaf shape, if we're talking about identifying plants, is such a key thing. And, you know, one characteristic to distinguish different leaves from each other is that margin smooth or does the margin have teeth or serrations on it? And there's actually been a big question in ecology going back decades to try to understand this because there's a global pattern where we find smooth margins or entire leaves versus serrated leaves. So in the tropics, almost everything has entire margin leaves, and then you move up to the temperate world, and we have lots of plants with serrated leaf margins. Birches, hickories, buckeyes. So, you know, people have propose all kinds of different hypotheses for like why tropical plants don't have serrated leaves and why we do have them in the temperate world. And so I'm pulling up a couple examples from our local flora. And leaf thickness turns out to be a big factor. So one time I walked into rhododendron leaf and the edge of it hit me in the eye. It was painful because it was a really stiff leaf. So that's rhododendron on the left, and then we have American chestnut on the right. I chose this picture because you can see how much light is coming through these leaves. They're very thin leaves. So it turns out that from a kind of efficiency in the mechanics of building a leaf and making sure you've got veins supplying water to all parts of the leaf, the most efficient shape for a leaf, if it's thin, is to have serrations on the margin. If it's thick, to have an entire margin. So like when you think about the different leaves around here, the thicker leaves tend to have a smooth margin and the thinner leaves tend to have serrations on them. And it turns out it's not strictly a tropical versus temperate thing. Like Mediterranean climates have a lot of thick leaves, and they also have almost entirely smooth margins on the leaves. So that's something folks have just figured out fairly recently. Now I don't want to give the impression that folks have figured out why species look the way they do completely. Like there's lots of traits that like it's got to be balanced against some other trait, and it's very complicated. And it's also turning out some things that we thought we knew, we still don't have figured out yet. So fall leaf color, you've probably heard that the colors we see in the fall were present there all along, and it's just the breakdown of chlorophyll that reveals them. And those pigments were there to protect the leaf from excess light often. So excess light can cause oxygen-free radicals which bounce around, tearing up cellular machinery, and these other pigments are antioxidants and protect against that kind of damage. So while that's true, the pigments can do that and are helpful, and the yellows we're seeing in the fall were there all along, it turns out some of the reds weren't there all along. People have just recently realized that some of the reds are actually produced late in the growing season, and they are specifically produced for the fall. And people are still trying to figure out exactly why that is. There's lots of, it's speculation at this point that might have to do with signaling to insects. The exact mechanisms vary in different hypotheses, but maybe signaling for the insects to like, don't eat me or don't lay your eggs on me, basically. But that's still being figured out. With that, appreciate all of y'all's attention, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Wow. What is that?
So that's big leaf magnolia. It's in a lot of the parks in Metro Atlanta. It tends to grow in ravines. It's in these box canyons in Alabama and Kentucky, because those are the places where wind won't totally shred the leaves. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about the climate change and how that's affecting the vegetation in our area?
Yeah. So with a caveat, I'm probably not the best person to talk about this because I haven't kept up in as much detail as some other people have. So we expect changes in phenology from climate change, which is the timing of different processes, so timing of leaf out and timing of flowering, and that's definitely happening. I know the spring wildflower pilgrimage in the Smokies has been moved a week earlier because the flowers were just coming out earlier. That's also going to affect insects and the relations of insects to plants. So one threat that people are concerned about is if there's a mismatch, if the insects and the plants are relying on different cues, it may be that the flowers open up and the insects aren't active yet. So that's one potential source of concern. Another thing that is definitely going to happen long term is that plants will move in response to climate change. we know this because they have done this before. So with glacial cycles, people have used pollen to look at when different species have moved back into an area. And some species, like white pine, I think made it to New England just a couple thousand years ago, but other species that are there now made it back 10,000 years ago. So different species have moved at different rates. And a big concern is that species won't be able to track the appropriate climate. We don't really know how fast species can move, but they will definitely have to move faster than they did in response to glaciation. And then some issues that may be further down the line for our area because we have more moisture, but like it's going to change disturbance regime. You know, we talked some about how different species are adapted to particular fire regimes. The fire regime could really change around here as things get hotter and as moisture evaporates from the landscape more quickly. So like the Rockies in some way may be a little bit of our future, and things are kind of disturbing in the Rockies right now. So drought is making trees vulnerable to a number of pests, and then like the mountain pine beetle, it's not being killed off by cold winter temperatures as much, so their populations have exploded. So there's really big areas of mortality in parts of the Rocky Mountains, and like I don't think that's going to happen in the next decade or two here, but on the trajectory we're on, it can certainly happen in another century.
Jess?
Yes, Mark.
I grew up in the Atlanta area,
Mhm.
and I noticed loblolly was dominant. And then as you get into Pickens County and points north, Virginia pine, it seems to replace it almost entirely. What's the main factor going on there? Is it just winters or summer temperatures?
Yeah, so some traits I didn't put in the talk because I was going to be speculating about what the causes were, and this is one of them. I'm guessing. One thing I would suspect is snow load. So, you know, I mentioned the possibility for ice to accumulate on longleaf pine. Loblolly pine also has relatively long needles, which is going to make it more vulnerable to snow and ice breaking it. And, you know, longleaf pine at least has really thick twigs. Loblolly pine doesn't have particularly thick twigs or particularly strong wood. So it's definitely vulnerable to that kind of damage. You know, there could be some role of competition too. I was just out looking at a really kind of productive site in the Cahaba Mountains a couple weeks ago. Had really big white pine. It also had some pretty big loblolly pine. That's an area where we don't have pitch pine, we don't have Table Mountain pine, but loblolly pine actually gets into the mountains a little bit over in that area. And the white pines were 20 feet taller than the loblolly pines. You know, we think of loblolly as super fast growing. White pine is also fast growing. So and it may be as you get into a little bit shorter growing season, white pine may actually be a little better adapted to cooler temperatures. And you know, there's some compromises with loblolly pine's got to be fairly well adapted to drought stress coming from a hotter climate. White pine might not handle drought stress as well, but that may like free up some other capacity in it. So those are the kinds of things I would look at, but I'm not really sure.
We'll have to set up the experiments.
Yeah. Sorry, you have a question.
Yeah, where the hemlocks that died in the Smokies, what's coming back in their place?
Yeah, so lots of things. Black birch is a really common species coming in after hemlock woolly adelgid. Tulip tree is definitely coming in on some sites. White pine is coming in on some sites. Red maple's probably benefiting some too. Those are the big tree species I've seen. They're kind of exploding as the hemlock canopy has died.
Teryn mentioned the champion trees that you've identified. We used to be able to find champion trees listed on a particular website, and we'd go to those places and try and find the
Oh,
tree.
cool.
And now that website seems to be gone, or maybe my
hosted by Georgia Forestry Commission. I usually get to it just by typing Georgia champion trees. I think if you type like Georgia big trees, it doesn't get you there, so it might just be that wording difference. But it is still an active program in Georgia. I know the national program has gone through some tumult, but it's being moved to the University of Tennessee, and it will be active going forward.
Oh, that's great.
It's kind of a broader question. I've been reading recently about vicariates of the tertiary forest that seems to, China has a much larger number of species than most of our deciduous trees, and we have some representatives of most of those genera, but maybe not as many. What was the biggest factor in the difference in our species? Is it purely genetic drift, or is there any environmental difference between some of the central or eastern Chinese deciduous forests versus the deciduous forest that we have? Presumably we started with a single population, and then as the climate got warmer and forced those, or colder maybe I should say, forced those deciduous trees further south. What's going on with the difference between here and China?
Okay, so I'm going to back up and give folks a little bit more background on that so that everyone can follow along. So I should look at the time frame, but I think it's 85 million years ago. Earth was far warmer than it is today, and the position of the continents at that time, a lot of the species we have around here actually grow in the Arctic at that time. So this is the tertiary period. I have to look up exactly when that is. But essentially, there was the same forest types were circumpolar. They went all the way around the Earth. So you'd have the same species in northern North America as you had in northern Asia and northern Europe at that time. And then as Earth has cooled and those species in general got pushed south by the colder temperatures, they've become isolated on different continents. So because of that common history though, like China has a species of tulip tree. China has a bunch of oak species. Europe has some oak species. You've got maples in Europe. You've got maples in China. This is also part of the reason why we get so many invasive species from Asia. They're in some ways pre-adapted and are often in terms of insects like hemlock woolly adelgid, like there's a adelgid that feeds on hemlocks in Asia because there are Asian hemlocks there. So that's why there's a kind of suitable host here. So Asia tends to be more diverse. Like if you look at a lot of different, if you look at, I don't know which specific genera to choose, but if you look at the tree genuses we have in common, Asia will often have more species than we do. Europe tends to have less species. Short answer is, I don't know why Asia actually has more species. It's a bigger landmass overall, which may have something to do with it. I've heard a lot more about the flip side, which I think you're probably already aware of why Europe has fewer species. The classic explanation for that is it has to do with glaciation and the arrangement of the mountain ranges. So our Appalachians run more or less north-south, so when glaciers kind of push species south, our species can kind of move along the Appalachians even if the higher elevations are a barrier to them. Versus in Europe, the Alps tend to run a little more east-west, so species kind of got squeezed between there's cold conditions in the Alps, there's cold conditions in the north, and as the glaciers advance south, they just get squeezed out of suitable habitat. So, that's the thinking of why Europe has 2 oak species and we have 36 native oak species in the southeast. And just in general, we have more species. I think hickories were totally eliminated from Europe versus we have like 13 species of hickory. I think we actually have more hickory species in Asia. But, like, I think Asia has more maples than we do. I don't know why that is.
So what is the magnolia that's native up here?
So we
I
have,
was thinking it was the big leaf, but it must be something else.
so if we're talking the mountains proper, we talk the eastern part of the mountains, we have two magnolia species around here: cucumber tree magnolia and Fraser magnolia. And the mnemonic I've kind of heard for that is Fraser is a man's name and men have ears. So there's little lobes at the base of the leaf on Fraser magnolia. Cucumbers don't have ears, and cucumber tree doesn't have ears at the base of the leaf. That works great when you only have two species of magnolia. As we move farther west in the mountains, we pick up umbrella magnolia. It's common as a streamside species in the Cajadas. It's also up in the Smokies. It's also in the Piedmont. As we move down to the Piedmont, we also pick up big leaf magnolia, which is really a species of a ravine. So, like Vickery Creek, several of the Chattahoochee River parks, particularly Vickery Creek, has a lot of it, and there's kind of like gorge topography along Vickery Creek, and that's what it's associated with there. And then you move farther south Georgia, we pick up ash magnolia, pure magnolia, and southern magnolia.
That's the state tree, that's not up here.
Yeah.
None of the ones that grow up here are evergreen.
Correct. Yeah. Southern magnolia. Well, Sweet Bay is also kind of evergreen. But, so yeah, it's only in the warmer climates you have more evergreen ones, and that relates. You know, there's a reason for that too. You know, leaves get damaged in the winter. Chlorophyll actually has a particular temperature range that it works in. If it gets too cold, it doesn't work. So with only a limited season that leaves are really functional most of the time, like that's an incentive for trees to drop them and regrow them. And then when you get to tropical climates, you can grow more of the year. It costs more to regrow the leaves than it does to just keep them around.
I know you work for the Wilderness Society now?
Yes.
What's their mission statement? How are they different from the Nature Conservancy?
So the Wilderness Society's mission is uniting people to protect our wild places. So the Wilderness Society, it specifically focuses on public lands. So we're involved with Forest Service management in this region. That's the most we're involved in this region. Out west, we work with Bureau of Land Management also a lot. We'll get involved with Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service and National Wildlife Refuges some too. Nature Conservancy deals with private land as well. You know, they were originally kind of buying up private land to protect it. They have shifted more into management focus. The Nature Conservancy, I would say, is much more comfortable with very active management than the Wilderness Society is. Although, despite our name, we are not hands-off, pristine management. Particularly these days, we're very recognizing the important role that indigenous people played in actively managing the lands. When Europeans showed up, it wasn't just nature without people. People were actively managing the land at that time. So those are a few of the kind of big thematic differences. But yeah, around here, we're mostly trying to get the Forest Service to not cut down old growth forests and not build roads in those areas. And Georgia ForestWatch is a local group that focuses specifically on North Georgia, and we work with them too.
So Sospi's Cove is one of those old growth forests.
Sospi Cove appears in the scientific literature as both an old growth forest and a second growth forest. So it's a kind of messy site because I think it was partially cleared but not totally cleared. So the Forest Service has a sign there that says, look at how wonderful it is that everything grew back and this was all cleared in 1902. That sign is propaganda. It's put up in front of a tulip tree that is over 5 feet in diameter, about 5.5 feet in diameter. That tree did not sprout in 1902. Like, to get that big, that tree is likely 300 or 400 years
Yeah.
old.
Wow.
And in fact, there's actually a friend of mine's kind of a forest historian. He's dug up some literature that, like, in the 50s, like in 30s, people knew that that site got partially cleared in the 1870s. So, like, a lot of the trees there date back to the mid 1870s, and then like the state champion buckeye is there. If you want to see the state champion tree, the state champion yellow buckeyes in Sosby Cove. It's right next to the road. It's 5 feet in diameter. It's a great one to go see in this area. Buckeyes are pretty slow growing. That buckeye is not 100 years old. Yeah, that buckeye's got to be 300 or 400 years old as well. So there's old trees, but there was also disturbance in there. Sosby Cove's kind of this messy site. I'm going to stick with this question a little bit.
Sure, okay.
Because, like, another question is, like, where to see old growth around here. So there's an area in the Suches area called Valley of the Giants. Like, I'd suggest if you Google, like, Suches and Valley of the Giants, you'll come up with directions. There's not an official trail to it, but you can kind of follow old logging roads and where other people have gone. It's about a mile hike to it. It has a 6-foot diameter tulip tree, as well as another one that's a former state champion that's got this big giant crown, like as big a crown as you will ever see on a tree in North Georgia. In that area, there was access to it, but it looks like there was no logging in there at all. There's 4-foot diameter white oaks in there as well, big northern red oaks. Like, it's a really impressive site, and unfortunately there's not like an officially maintained trail to it, but it's about a mile walk in there, and it's not any dramatic ups and downs. You may just have to deal with a few fallen trees to get in there. So that's a great site to see. Really the best site left for old growth on a good site. We also have lots of old growth in North Georgia that wasn't logged because there wasn't any commercial incentive to. It's, you know, forests growing on thin soils, steep south-facing slopes that dry out quickly, and there, you know, the trees are all crooked. The tree might be 300 years old and just this big. So they're just like, if you can't get many board feet out of it, it doesn't make sense to like haul wood miles to the mill. That's what a lot of our old growth is remaining in North Georgia. And now that I'm thinking about, since the hike-in came up earlier, most of the trail to the hike-in actually goes through old growth. There were a few little farmed areas. You can note them from an abundance of Virginia pine. By cord of chestnut oak right next to that trail that was 300 years old. And just because I'm rambling, so I might as well keep going. So Amicalola Falls, like our highest cascade in Georgia, it's falling off a big plateau. There's Cochran's Falls and Berrigan Falls that fall off that same plateau. That plateau is there in part because it's more erosion-resistant rock, which in this case means rock with a lot of quartz in it. Quartz is often relatively nutrient poor. That plateau there, you've got this big escarpment, these steep slopes kind of blocking access. And then on top of that plateau, you have relatively nutrient poor soils. So the trees were hard to get to and they weren't very big, so that's why they didn't get cut that much. The drainage above Amicalola Falls was cut, but the drainages to the east of there, particularly the one that goes over Cochran Falls, again, there were a few isolated farms up there, but there's never any industrial logging in there because the trees are about that big and 300 years old. So I'm going to go to Mark and then come back.
Can we clear up the distinction between what's commonly called virgin forest versus old growth versus mature forest?
So, old growth sounds good. So people have kind of slapped the old growth label on all kinds of things, and it's been defined a lot of different ways and used a lot of different ways. Yeah, and then virgin forest is kind of this idea of untouched forest, which often means unlogged forest. This is probably maybe a longer answer than we have time for. Mature forest is also a term that just kind of gets thrown around and means that like the trees are kind of what you're used to around here. You know, they're reproducing, they're relatively large, they've done most of their high growth, but there's not like good tight definitions for it. So it's kind of context dependent of what definition are people using. Okay, sorry, you had one more
Well,
thought.
it's still in that same vein, like, so logging wasn't completely done. Logging didn't take everything here.
That's correct. So industrial logging in North Georgia was mostly 1880s through 1930s. And there were some areas where they did kind of cut pretty much the whole watershed. The Cohuttas got logged by railroad, and the areas that are now in Cohutta Wilderness, they got cut relatively late, and they got cut relatively thoroughly. So like the only old growth I'm really aware of in the Cohutta Wilderness is in the middle of this talus slope, where I've seen cable, they tried to drag trees out of that talus, but they didn't get the trees in the interior of the talus slope there. But lots of other places, whether old growth was cut, came down to a cost-benefit analysis. If you got to drag the wood a long way to a mill, that's more cost. Steep slopes are more difficult to build roads on, so it makes road building, like if there's a waterfall, like we were just talking about, it wasn't cut above Cochran's Falls, like you've got to build more road because you've got like zigzag way around that big waterfall, that's more cost. So if the trees, you know, in the other sections, like how much wood value can you get out of an area, if trees aren't economically valuable species, or really if they're small and crooked, you don't get that many bore feet out of them. So there's less incentive to log those areas. So there are lots of relatively small areas scattered all over the mountains where they were relatively hard to get to. The trees weren't that big, weren't very straight, so it just wasn't worth it to the loggers to log them. The one other factor that can come into play is ownership patterns. So my friend Cliff Shaw, who's doing a bunch of forest history research, there's an area that's now in the Mark Trail Wilderness, so just southeast from Brasstown Ball, going north from Hog Pen Gap. One timber company owned most of the Chattahoochee River watershed, the headwaters of the Chattahoochee. They logged it by railroad in the 1920s, but they didn't own all the way up to the ridgeline that the AT is on. The lumber company who owned the other side of the ridge owned that area. So there's this pretty big area in there that was never logged because the company with the access didn't own the land, and the company that owned the land would have had to come over this major ridge and then drag heavy logs uphill. So there's this block in there that just never really got logged, and it was related to ownership patterns. Yeah.
When the hardwoods are cut down and they sucker back up, what happens? Are they gonna be a poor quality tree? I mean, what's the right way to manage that?
Yeah, so pretty much any hardwood will resprout, and if they're coming off a common stump, which is usually going to happen if you cut down a relatively young tree, old trees really don't sprout from the stump that much. It does affect wood quality, like that fusion area usually isn't very good wood, so you're going to lose kind of the bottom portion of the tree, which is actually where the most volume is. So yeah, from a pure timber management perspective, you're going to get less wood out of those trees. Versus like if you've got something like black locust, which will sucker from the roots, each stem is coming up independently, and then it's going to be wood that's the same as seed origin. We'll get a little bit faster start because it's tapped into that existing root system, but timber quality wise, that won't be any different.
Just aesthetically, what do you want to do when you have that problem?
So some people like that aesthetic. So if you look at river birches, they're planted ornamentally, they're almost always 3-stem. If you go and look at river birches in the wild, you can find 3-stem ones, but normally they're single-stemmed. They're 3-stemmed because landscape architects expect them to be 3-stemmed. It's actually a disadvantage. This was on I-75, I-85 combined in Atlanta. There's one spot where they planted some river birches next to it. The river birches are now about yay big. River birch is a pretty short-lived species. I think often they start conking out after 40, 50 years. And one of them in this group of 3, you know, it conked over because a very narrow fork, it can kind of like crush the cells in there. It's often a point of weakness. It's like, even if you've got a single tree that goes up 20 or 30 feet and it has a narrow fork, that is often a place where they will peel apart in a storm. I just, all the way over here, actually that one snapped. So like arborists, you know, if they're looking at your tree health, if there's a fork, particularly if it kind of like pancakes out, where it's like the stems are trying to grow around, like that's going to be a point of concern, as opposed to like black walnut is really good at having really broad forks. If you look at black walnut, they just, I think there's a genetic propensity, they don't produce narrow forks. They just don't run into that problem. And then on tree ID traits, pitch pine is the pine around here that's most prone to forking. They tend to have a very rounded crown, and it's common for them to fork much more so than the other pine species around here.
I'm sorry, I find you fascinating. I could talk to you for hours. What is your area of study, and now you belong to this wilderness society?
So what I did for my master's was actually looking at using tree rings to see how weather affected tree growth. I studied eastern red cedar and common juniper, which is this essentially boreal shrub, but it's in the same genus as the eastern red cedar. I looked at how they grew similarly or differently when they were growing on the same sites. This is this weird setup where it's the very southern edge of the range for common juniper and the very northern edge of the range for eastern red cedar. And it turned out that like they both care about, if it gets really hot and dry in the summer and they don't have much water, that slows growth for both of them. But longer term trends, it looked like common juniper wasn't doing as well, which might be a climate change effect through some mechanism I never quite sorted out. And then, yeah, so that was my background. I've been involved looking at effects of floods on forests along the Missouri River and along the Sacramento River in California. It turns out rivers moving around is a really important process because they create new land and allow specific species that need that bare land close to the water table to colonize, and then other species will come in after them. If you don't have the rivers moving around, you don't get the same forest type developing. You just lose the cottonwood forest completely and everything that expects cottonwood forest to be there. And also, like bank swallows want a steep eroding bank to nest in, and piping plovers want sandbars. And like dams and not letting rivers move around screws up all kinds of things. So that's some of my research background, and then like now I'm still involved in old growth a little bit. Just recently there was the Forest Service is proposing new rules for how they manage old growth nationwide. So I worked with a team of colleagues. And colleagues are way better at crafting policy language than I am, but I got to be like part of that team and talk about like how old growth is being managed in the southeast and what the problems are here versus out west. Because out west, it's all fire. Here, like logging is still a much bigger issue for old growth. So, I'm not sure if that answers your question. That's kind of a little more on the background.
Why are our forests have such skinny trees?
Is it weather?
Well, let's just say I live up 3 miles up a ridge. It's a neighborhood, and there's lots of woods and there's lots of forests around, not in my yard, but they're there, but the trees seem so skinny.
Too close to the pack.
So, there's multiple things that could be going on. It could be partially just the age of the trees, like you may just have younger trees. Part of it could be soil conditions. Like the biggest one is going to be how much moisture. So if you look at the things that limit a tree's growth, light is number one. So like a little hemlock that's been sitting in the shade, if the tree above it slows down, it can increase its radial growth rate by a factor of 10. Like trees can really respond when they get a lot more light. And then the next biggest factor is going to be water supply. Like a skinny ring versus a wide ring on a tree, that's going to be largely water supply. So if you're on a dry site, your trees like are just going to grow a lot slower. Soil nutrients can be a factor too, but that's kind of down the list and on average won't make as big of a difference to the tree size. And then there's kind of like bigger climate factors. Why are there giant trees in the West Coast? And that may relate to El Nino and fire and all kinds of things. And like, you know, we have way bigger trees than the Southwest does, and that's just a water supply thing. All right, sorry, Greg, I think you had a question?
Yeah, you mentioned a nationwide old growth management,
Yes.
I don't know, regime. Is that really wise? A one size fits all for a continent when we have so many different ecological areas? Isn't it wiser to have different policies in different areas?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and the pushback on that national amendment has been mostly two ways. One, you're distracting us from fire, which is what people out west sometimes say, and then two is this idea of like there should be more local adaptation, because you're right, like we have like 128 different national forests, and within each national forest you're going to have like a dozen or more forest types. Like nationally we have all these different forests, and like this comes back to the definition question also, like how do you even define old growth going across the country? So the people who are putting together this amendment, it's an amendment to the forest plan which governs each national forest. So the team at the Forest Service that was putting together this amendment was very aware of those things, and they addressed it two basic ways. One, they're not using one definition for old growth all across the country. Each region of the Forest Service comes up with their own kind of regional definition, and then within those regional definitions, there's definitions for different forest types. So we're not dealing with one definition of old growth across the country, we're actually dealing with a few dozen. And then the second thing that was done was, this gets a little complicated, but they called on each forest to kind of define their own old growth strategy and say where this amendment should be applied to. So they were saying it shouldn't apply everywhere within the national forest. For old growth, it will, but for recruiting future old growth, so what mature forest should turn into old growth in the future, they said on that, like, the priorities need to be set locally. So there is local planning built into this national program. And like, there's still some problems with that. It's really tricky to pull this off, but there's some compromises being made with that specific concern in mind.
Thanks.
Yeah, but really good question. All right, I may wrap up the Q&A, but I will hang around, and if I drink some water, I might be able to answer some. So thank you all.
Thank you.